Okay, well, my seventh lecture in this series, in fact, it is predominantly on metaphor. I will have, actually, there's not enough time, actually, to go into metonymy, and I'll have only a few words to say about blending at the end. So to some extent, the title is deceptive. It's basically about metaphor, actually. Now, for many people who don't know much about cognitive linguistics, they tend to have the impression that cognitive linguistics is the study of metaphor. So cognitive linguistics, actually for many people, is equated with metaphor. Right? If you do cognitive linguistics, you do metaphor. That actually is not quite true. There are other important topics in cognitive linguistics, but metaphor certainly is a very important one. The topic was basically put on the agenda by George Lakoff, which I'm sure you know about, with his, well, I've got here a couple of important, well, defining works. Lakoff and his colleague Johnson, who is basically a philosopher rather than a linguist, their two books, Metaphors We Live By, and 20 years later, Philosophy in the Flesh. Crucial works for the cognitive linguistic approach to metaphor. Interestingly, the other big name in cognitive linguistics, Ronald Lannecker, actually, he hasn't actually said very much about metaphor. So Lannecker's work shows, in fact, that you can do cognitive linguistics without doing metaphor. But anyway, I want to briefly outline the main aspects of Lakoff's theory. Most of you, well, I don't actually know your backgrounds, but I imagine that many or most of you will in fact be familiar with this. So what I have to say in the first part of my lecture basically is addressed to those people who are perhaps not quite so familiar with this topic. Then, in the second half, I will raise some problems that I have and that other people have with Lakoff's theory of metaphor, and then finally go on, I'll say something about the theory of blending, which is a theory which actually, in a way, supersedes Lakoff's metaphor theory. It includes and covers Lakoff's metaphor theory, but it includes much more else besides. Okay, so the theory of blending, in fact, is much more general, and metaphor is just one small aspect of blending. Okay, let me see. Right, of course, people have been studying metaphor, well, certainly in the West, for 2,500 years. It's been an important topic in Western thinking about language, about philosophy, and, of course, literary criticism. And metaphor is often thought of as something which is used in poetry, in literature, for sort of rhetorical or expressive effect. What Lakoff and Johnson did, was to point out that much ordinary language is deeply metaphorical. So you can have metaphor is not restricted to poetry or to creative writing or to special expressive language, but ordinary, everyday language, even the most common and ordinary of expressions, can be metaphorical and can have a metaphorical basis. And here are some examples. These are not Lakoff's examples. In fact, these are taken from my own book on cognitive grammar 2 or 3 years ago. If you consider these expressions which are used to talk about a discussion, you're having a discussion, and you report on the discussion that you had. What kinds of things might you say about the discussion that you have? Well, you might say, well, we started out from these premises. A premise, you know, is an assumption, what you assume, and then you, to use a metaphor, build on it. Okay. We started out from these premises, and we arrived at these conclusions. So you start from or start out from your premise, you argue, and then you arrive at the conclusion. Now, in the course of the discussion, you might say, well, we have now arrived at a crucial point in the argument. We have arrived at a crucial point in the argument. Or we're having this discussion, and you start saying something, and I say to you, where are you going with this? I don't see the point of it. Where are you going with this, with these remarks? Or else I might say to you, well, I see where you're coming from. I see why you are making those remarks. I can see what your premise is, or what the motivation is behind what you're saying. I see where you're coming from. Or I might say, you're wandering off the topic. You're wandering off the topic. Or, well, we've discussed this, now let's move on to the next point. Or you say something which I don't quite understand, and I ask you to go over it again. Can you please go over that again? Another way would be, could you please take me through that again? Could you please take me through that again? Okay, now, why have I chosen these examples? Well, they're all pretty ordinary expressions, nothing remarkable about them. But I chose these, well, the point I want to, what I want to point out is the fact that all of these expressions include words, usually verbs actually, but that's quite by chance, which have to do with traveling. Right? Start out from. You make a journey and you start out from home and you arrive at your destination. So you start out from one place and you arrive somewhere else. And on your journey you arrive at a certain point in the middle of your journey. You go somewhere when you're on a journey. You come from somewhere on a journey, and on your journey you might sort of wander off the path. On your journey you might stop for a rest and then you move on. Or you might actually repeat your journey. You might go someplace and then go over the path again. So in these very ordinary expressions you have a number of words, basically verbs, but as I say, that's quite by chance, which have to do with traveling. You have start out, arrive, go, come, to wander, and to move. Now, Lakhov's great achievement was to show that these expressions have a certain system to them. Right? And the system, basically, well, the metaphorical system, essentially what you're doing, you're using words which describe a journey to describe a discussion or an argument. And the underlying metaphor would be that traveling is reasoning. You use words which are involved, which basically refer to going on a journey, to describe discussion. Okay? And this, of course, is the essence of metaphor. Metaphor, you use words which are basically, which basically have to do with one domain, one area of experience, to talk about another area of experience. In this case, traveling, you use words which have to do with going on a journey, traveling, to talk about something else, which is discussing, arguing, reasoning. So there are two domains of experience involved. A domain would be, as I say, some area of experience. Traveling and reasoning, discussing. And metaphor involves using words from one domain to talk about the other. And the terms which are commonly used here, you refer to the source domain and the target domain. So you take words from the source domain to talk about the target domain. You talk about the target domain in terms of words from the source domain. Source and target, these correspond, of course, to the words, to the terms which literary critics use, the vehicle and tenor of a metaphor, which are difficult. Source and target are much clearer terms. Okay? Source, where you're coming from, target, where you're going to. Also metaphors, of course. Now, if you consider the two domains, traveling and reasoning, you will see that there is in fact a whole set of correspondences, right, which in fact are made use of in these expressions. So the traveler, the person who travels, corresponds to the person who is thinking or reasoning. The departure point on your journey corresponds to your premises in your argument, where the arrival point is the conclusion. Moving along on your journey corresponds to the actual process of thinking and reasoning. The path itself is the argument. The places on the path are the points in the argument. If you make an argument, you have points. Point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the places on your path as you go through it. If you stray from the path, you stray from the argument. There might be two people on the journey. You follow somebody. Somebody leads you. You follow the person. So you can follow an argument. You can follow what people are saying. So following the traveler is understanding what people are saying. You follow what they say. And to go over the journey again is to go over the argument again. So there's a whole set of correspondences here. And these are referred to as conceptual metaphors. And they're typically written in capital letters, like here. A line of thought is a path. A premise is a starting point. A conclusion is a destination. Understanding is following. Now, these are conceptual metaphors which have to do with the correspondences between the two domains. And it's actually quite important to distinguish between conceptual metaphors like these and actual linguistic expressions like we arrived at the conclusion. Okay? So we arrived at the conclusion is the metaphorical expression, and a conclusion is a destination, is the abstract metaphor which underlies this. In fact, the relation between the conceptual metaphor and the actual linguistic expression is the familiar one. Well, if you've heard my previous lectures, it'll be familiar too. It is the relation of the schema and the instance, once again. The schema is the abstract, general representation, and the instance is the the more detailed example. And in fact, I'll just see if this works. How does it go? So at the bottom, you have the actual expressions. On the left, we started out from these premises. I can see where you're coming from. On the right, we came to these conclusions. Where are you heading? Where are you going? These are the actual linguistic expressions. Now, these actual linguistic expressions are examples. They are instances of the conceptual metaphor. So the conceptual metaphor on the left, a premise is a starting point, a conclusion is a destination. And in fact, those two conceptual metaphors are perhaps examples of an even more general or abstract or schematic metaphor, namely that ideas are locations, right? Ideas are places, and you go from one idea to another. So you have this very abstract, this very general metaphor. You speak about ideas as if they were places, and that gives you the more specific metaphor. Your starting idea, the initial idea, your discussion, is the starting point of a journey, and your conclusion is your destination. And then at the bottom you have the actual linguistic expressions. Okay? Now to switch back, I go that one. Sorry. Okay, it's that and that. Okay, okay, right. Okay. Okay, now that is one example of conceptual metaphor of the kind studied by Lakoff and Johnson. I just want to mention a couple more. A very important one, actually, which has been much discussed. In fact, the conduit metaphor was analyzed actually before Lakoff. It actually predated Lakoff's study by a man called Michael Reddy, who published his paper in 1979, I think, a year before Lakoff. This concerns a conceptual metaphor which we use in order to talk about communication, about language. So it's a metaphor of language and of communication. And some of the conceptual metaphors here, well, perhaps we should actually look at the actual linguistic expressions. Oh no, sorry, I don't have them. Okay, the actual linguistic expressions would be things like put your ideas into words. If you put your ideas into words, here we are, yes. I find it difficult to put my ideas into words. These are empty words. They don't mean anything. Empty words. I didn't get much out of that lecture. You go to a lecture and you didn't get much out of it. I can't get my ideas across to people, or your ideas came across very well, or your essay has no content. The underlying conceptual metaphor there would be that as ideas, let's go back, ideas are objects. Words, sentences are containers. You put ideas into words. Words have a content. A sentence, a book has a content. Right? Communication consists of, well, I take my ideas, I put them into words, I then send the words to you through, well, in this case, through the air, but I can also send my words to you through a telephone line or through the post office on a piece of paper. So I send the containers to a hearer, and the hearer or the reader then takes the contents out of the container. So this is actually one way in which people talk about communication. Okay? And it is deeply metaphorical. Okay? So, one point there you will notice on the previous thing when talking about arguing and reasoning, the underlying metaphor was that ideas are places, ideas are locations. Here we have ideas are objects. Notice that there are different metaphors for talking about something. Right? You can have different metaphors. So metaphors are not necessarily consistent with each other. And that is very clear, actually, with the next example I want to talk about. Again, this is been discussed very often. You talk about time as if it was space. You use spatial expressions to talk about time. For example, if you say winter is approaching, well, approach is, winter is coming near, winter is approaching. Or even we are getting closer to winter. Winter is getting closer to us, we are getting closer to winter. You look forward to the future, you look back on the past. What lies ahead of us? What will the future bring? What lies ahead of us? put this behind, let's forget this, put it behind us. You talk about the coming events and, of course, the past. Past events, which is spelled P-A-S-T, but in fact it is, in fact, events which have passed. And, okay, I'll talk about the next one in a moment. Notice that there are here two metaphors, actually, which are a bit different. We are getting closer to winter. Winter is getting closer to us. So there's a metaphor of, actually I need a blackboard for this, which we don't have, but never mind. So I'll have to draw in the air. Is there a blackboard? Oh, there is a blackboard. Oh. I'm sure you actually use diagrams like this when teaching about tense in English and other languages. So that is time. This is now, and that is the future. Okay, and that's the past. This is a future event. Okay? Now the passing of time, again the metaphor, there are in fact two ways of looking at it. One is that you are moving into the future. Right? You go into the future. Like we say, we are moving towards winter. The other metaphor is that the future moves towards us. Right? Winter is approaching. It approaches you, it passes you, and then it is past. It has passed you. So it's as if, so the movement is, well, the way I've written that, of course, is also a sort of metaphor. The future on the right, past on the left. I don't know why I do that. It's sort of, the future seems to be on the right and the past. Anyway, you get the point. There are two metaphors. Okay? Now, what are we? Yes. Okay, so if you say winter is approaching, it's in the future and it approaches you, you look forward to the future, well, you're looking into the future that way, what lies ahead of us, and so on. Let's have a look at that one. I don't know whether, do you know this example? I'm alluding to a quite important recent publication, well, publication of 4 or 5 years ago. Let us say a meeting has been planned for next Wednesday. Okay? The meeting has been planned for Wednesday, and then somebody says, well, let's move the meeting forward 2 days. The meeting is scheduled, is planned for Wednesday. Let's move the meeting forward 2 days. When does the meeting take place? Okay. Who says Friday? Who says Monday? Who says Friday? Who says Monday? You get the point? Is it the meeting is planned for Wednesday? Okay, let's change the date. We don't want it on Monday, we want to move it forward 2 days. Anybody say Monday? And in fact, I've tried this with several groups of English speakers, and in fact, people split 50-50. I've tried this with a couple of groups of English-speaking, native-speaking students, and typically the people split 50-50. Half say Friday, half say Monday. And you can see why? It's according to... Okay? If that is when... Right. I think this is actually far too sensitive. It's getting... Right. And for Wednesday, if you move it forward 2 days, which way is forward? Well, it depends. If you take the view that future events are coming to you, forward is here. If you take the view that forward is the way in which you are moving, it's there. So there are two different metaphors then, two alternative and perhaps competing metaphors. Which both involve the idea of moving, right, and the future being in front, and they both involve motion, but and the two metaphors are in English, right? They're both important in English. The coming weeks and you go into the future, they are both quite normal expressions. But there are, say, two ways of interpreting that expression according to which metaphor you actually use. And as I say, when I've done this with groups of English people, some of them seem to operate with one metaphor and the other operates with the other metaphor. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment because it is actually rather an interesting example. So, we've had three examples of conceptual metaphors. A general comment is that if you look, if you were to look at several more of these, the source domains where you are taking the language from involve things like moving, location, container, to be in, distance, far and near, up, down, heavy, hot, and so on. These are the source domains. And the target domains, the kinds of things you are talking about, time, we've had, life, emotions, reasoning, value judgments, communication, and so on. There is a general pattern here in that the source domains tend very often to be, concrete. Things that you experience directly. Hot, cold, up, down, near, far, places, traveling, and so on. The target domains tend to be abstract. Emotions, thoughts, feelings, judgments, communication, life, time, and so on. And one of the points that Lakoff made was that the function of metaphor, why do we have metaphor? It's because we want to talk about these target domains, which are very abstract, they're very difficult to talk about. I mean, if I ask you, what is time? If you are a physicist, perhaps you have an answer. But for ordinary people, you can't actually say what time is. Actually, it's difficult to say what space is as well, but time clearly is sort of more abstract and intangible. You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't, You can only measure it by means of watches and clocks, which is, okay. So these things are very abstract, difficult to understand. So you talk about these difficult abstract things in terms of things which are much more concrete, much more immediate, actually. And one of Lakoff's points was that you use metaphor in order to understand. So metaphor is not just for poetic effect, but it's to enable you to understand difficult abstract concepts. Let me see. Now, a couple more points about metaphor. Where do these metaphors come from? Let's look at a couple more, actually. I mentioned the up-down metaphor. Up, down, high, low. These expressions are used, of course, not just to refer to space, up, down, high, and low, but also for lots of other things, like a high temperature. You get up in the morning. You are up, I feel down. Somebody with a high status job. So use high and up to refer to more, quantity. Up and down, if you are down, you are depressed and sad. So to be up, you are, cheer up. So up is associated then with being happy, joyful, and so on. It's associated with people with status and power, high status, and so on. And a high position in the company and a low position in the company. Okay? So up and down is then associated with quantity, happiness, life, health, status, power. And the reason for that is, I suppose, fairly obvious. That if you are, healthy and alive and awake and conscious, you are up. If you are ill or dead, you are quite literally down. If there's a physical conflict between two people, the winner is up and the loser is in fact down. So there is a natural association between being up and, say, being alive, healthy, awake, conscious, powerful. And the relation, in fact, is the relation of metonymy. They are associated. They are associated within a single domain. Right? Metaphor comes about when these two things get dissociated, and you talk about a person with high status, even though they are not physically, literally high. So the metaphor comes about actually when this association, when the two ideas get dissociated. You can do the same with other things, for example, hot and cold. Hot is associated with enthusiasm and excitement. Cold with the opposite. So if you're a cold person, it's somebody who doesn't show emotion, right? No feelings. The argument heated up. People started shouting and getting excited. If the argument heats up, then you must cool it. Right? And this perhaps is one reason why these conceptual metaphors tend very often to be universal. That is to say, they are not specific to a single language. You tend to find them in many, many different languages. I'm not so sure about the Chinese ones, but I would imagine the hot, cold with enthusiastic and lack of emotion, up with power, down with lack of power, and the moving and the motion and the passing of time. Although it is often said actually that Chinese has another metaphor for time where the future is not in front but also up. Is that true? That the future comes down to you? No? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so there are possibly good reasons why these metaphors could be universal. However, even though the conceptual metaphors might be universal, the actual linguistic expressions, the actual instantiations of these, could well be language specific. Okay? So the conceptual metaphors might be quite general, shared by different languages, different cultures, different traditions, though the actual linguistic expressions you use could well be very different. Okay, so that is essentially Lakoff's theory of metaphor in very, very simple outline. And as you are perhaps aware, a lot of work has been done on this. You can imagine all sorts of research projects that you can do in this. You take a particular domain of experience, look at the metaphors that are involved, or you contrast two languages, two cultures, comparing and contrasting the metaphors. So in the next part of my lecture, second half, I want to consider some possible problems that we have that arise in connection with this theory of metaphor. One possibility, one objection would be to say, well, these are dead metaphors. Arrive at a conclusion. That's a dead metaphor. There's another metaphor here. Metaphors can be alive and dead. A dead metaphor, well, it might have been metaphorical once, but now, for modern speakers, to arrive at a conclusion is not a metaphor. That's the way you say it. There's no other way to say it, basically. But English speakers don't actually think of it as metaphorical. The metaphor is not actually activated when you use these expressions. So our expressions such as the coming weeks and all the rest of them a passing fashion. That's another one, of course, of things come into fashion, go out of fashion. Fashions pass, just as things pass you on the journey. So are these just conventionalized expressions, or is the metaphor actually active for speakers? Well, actually, the example we looked at there on moving the meeting forward 2 days suggests that the metaphor actually might be active. The very fact that there are 2 ways of interpreting it, some people interpret it one way, other people interpret it the other way, suggests in fact that the metaphor is actually being used. That you are drawing on the metaphor in order to understand the expression. Okay? Now, a psychologist called Boroditsky did some research on this, and it's quite a fascinating story that she told concerning moving the meeting forward. Okay. Coming back to the picture here, how you interpret it is whether you are moving forward or whether the future is moving to you. And the question that she addressed was, why do some people activate one metaphor and other people use the other metaphor? So she thought, is it possible to actually make people use one of the 2 metaphors? And the experiment she did was actually a very simple experiment. It shows you can do experiments in all sorts of strange situations. She asked this question about moving the meeting forward of people standing in a line at the university cafeteria. Okay? So you have the university cafeteria, people are there waiting for their lunch, and there was apparently a very long line of people with their trays waiting for their lunch. And the people at the back of the queue were simply sort of standing. But the people at the front of the queue, they were actually moving forward to get their lunch. And what she found was that the people at the front of the queue who were actually moving forward, who could think of themselves moving forward to get their lunch, actually used the metaphor, this one. So moving the meeting forward was putting it there. Whereas the people who were just hanging around, standing at the back of the queue, they did not have the impression of moving forward. They tended to use the other metaphor. Or perhaps to put it a little more accurately, the percentage of people who saw forward as that direction, the percentage of people increased as they got nearer the front of the queue, and as they actually had the experience of moving forward, which is actually quite a remarkable discovery if you think about it. It shows that there are these 2 metaphors, and that the metaphors can be actually activated by non-linguistic situations. So if you are actually physically have the feeling of moving forward, you tend to use the metaphor whereby you forward is that way in front of you. Whereas if you're just standing waiting, forward tends to be that way. I think she repeated this actually an airport lounge where people had just arrived or when their plane had been delayed or whatever, and got very similar results. Now she repeated this sort of question in different kinds of association, in different kinds of circumstances, which, as I say, is quite a remarkable finding. Another piece of evidence that these metaphors might be active was done by Raymond Gibbs, closely associated with Lakoff. You take the metaphor or the idiom "spill the beans," which is to tell the secret. You have a secret information, private information, and you tell people. And he asked people to think about the metaphor "spill the beans," and then asked these people what seemed to be rather silly questions, like where were the beans before they were spilled? How big was the container? Okay. And the kinds of answers people gave would suggest that the container is the head or something about the size of the head. The beans are things in this container, and then they spill out. Okay? Another piece of evidence that some metaphors can be active is the productivity of metaphor. And you can see metaphors being created, actually, day by day, especially when you have a new technology like computers. Think of all the ways you talk about things that can go wrong with the computer. The virus. Well, that is a medical term. So you have a virus and bugs, you get infected and you must be disinfected, and all the whole medical terminology is then lifted onto computer talk. Okay? And there, clearly, the metaphor is actually quite active, I think. But there are actually... one has to be actually quite careful here. So spill the beans. Sorry, there's a P missing there. If you take the metaphor of spill the beans, which is, as I say, and let the cat out of the bag, which has roughly the same meaning, right? And to tell the secret. Okay? So the bag, you've got a sack, there's a cat in it. The cat is the secret. The bag contains the secret. Open bag, the cat jumps out, everybody knows the secret. Notice that those expressions, there is no actual productivity there. You can't change them. You can see what the metaphor is, right? The cat and the beans are the secret, and they jump out, and the secret becomes public. But it's not productive. That is to say, you cannot let the dog out of the bag. Well, you can, but it doesn't have the metaphorical meaning. You can't let the bird out of the cage to mean reveal the secret. You can't spill the peas or spill the potatoes or whatever, or spill the rice or whatever. So these are fixed expressions. You can see the metaphor, you can see the image, you can picture, but there's actually no productivity. Now that is different from, say, arrive at the conclusion, because you can actually vary that. You can say, we'll arrive at the conclusion. We are approaching the conclusion. We are getting very near to the conclusion. We are still a long way away from the conclusion. There's a whole set of expressions which you can use quite productively with that conceptual metaphor. Or if you take the expression, I'm looking forward to seeing you again, I'm looking forward, you can see what the metaphor is, but notice that it is absolutely fixed. You can't vary it. You can't There's no sort of productivity there. You can't say, I'm looking towards seeing you again. Right? I'm looking in the direction of seeing you again. Or even, I'm looking directly forward to seeing you again. Or I'm looking ahead to seeing you again. Or those are just not possible. The ones with the star here are not possible. So to some extent, this actually is a conventionalized, it's a frozen, to use another metaphor, a frozen metaphor. There is no productivity there at all. Okay? And notice you can't say, where are you looking forward to? Okay? Which you have to say, what are you looking forward to? Right? Now, okay. So as one objection that is sometimes made in connection with Lakoff's theory is that, well, most of the metaphors that Lakoff talks about are simply dead metaphors. They are conventional metaphors. They are, in fact, no longer metaphors. It's just a standard way of speaking. Okay? That probably is not 100% the case, because there is a certain amount, these metaphors can be activated, as we see with the moved meeting forward. But on the other hand, some of these expressions are absolutely fixed. You can't use them productively. You can't utilize the conceptual metaphor to create new expressions. Here, for example. However, I think here we have perhaps a more serious problem with the Lakoff theory. So it's often stated by Lakoff and people that that we use conceptual metaphors, that we use metaphor in order to gain understanding of abstract, intangible concepts. Intangible, you can't touch them. Also a metaphor. So we talk about abstract concepts in terms of concrete and the familiar. Metaphor, therefore, makes it possible for us to think about abstract things. But there is a problem here, I think. If you take, for example, emotions and feelings, I didn't give examples from this domain, but emotions are often spoken of in metaphorical terms. When you get angry, you get hot. Right? Cool down. When you get angry, you say, my blood is boiling. Right? You get heated, a heated discussion, and so on. So you talk about anger in terms of metaphor. Depression, you are down. So you talk about emotions and feelings and thoughts and so on in metaphorical terms. So emotions, feelings, and thoughts are the typical target domains of conceptual metaphors. But notice, if you look at that in connection with the first paragraph there, can we really say that we need metaphor in order to understand our emotions and feelings? I mean, if there was anything that you are familiar with, it is your own thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I mean, what else is there anything else more immediate for your own knowledge than that? So it actually doesn't make sense to say that you cannot actually understand your emotions. You can't understand how you feel unless you have metaphors. It's sort of absurd. Now, another possibility, actually, is that we use metaphor to talk about these abstract concepts like emotions, feelings, and time, and so on, not because we need to conceptualize abstract thought, but in order to be able to talk about these things to other people. The point about emotions and feelings is that these are private, right? They are inside you. Yeah. I cannot feel your feelings and you cannot feel mine. They are inevitably private. So when I talk about my feelings, how do you know what I'm talking about? There's no possibility of two people actually agreeing on what the feelings are. But concrete, especially spatial language, is able to be validated by different speakers. So if I say that one thing is higher than another, that is something that we can all look at and examine and we can agree. Right? We can agree on it because we can all see it. Or if you say that you travel from here to here, I mean that is an event in space and time, and you can observe it and you can say whether it's true or not or whatever. So concrete, especially spatial language, is able to be validated. You can say whether it's true or not, or you can assess it by different speakers, and different speakers are likely to agree. So one possibility is that we use these metaphors, we use the concrete language, because concrete language, we can agree on what it means. Right? So by talking about abstract things in concrete terms, we give the impression that we are saying things that can be tested and assessed and validated. So that possibly is one reason why we tend to prefer concrete words of space, place, motion, up, down, and so on, for talking about metaphor. So I want now to look at some more specific criticisms of Lakoff's theory of metaphor. I've addressed already the question of, or I've touched on the question of why we have metaphor. Okay, why do we use metaphor? Why don't we say what we mean rather than use these metaphors? Well, one point is it's very often difficult not to use metaphor because there's no other way to say it. If you arrive at a conclusion, what else do you say? But there are plenty of expressions actually where you can think of where you can actually remove the metaphor. If you say that he is a very cold person, you could say, well, he's a person who doesn't show emotion, he doesn't show feeling, right? Why do we use metaphor? Why do we say things which are actually, strictly speaking, false? If you say he is a cold person, you are not actually referring to the body temperature. Right? So you're saying something which is actually, strictly speaking, wrong or misleading. Why do we do that? Well, one answer to the question is that, to ask that question is based on a premise, and the premise is that metaphors are not literally true. So you have the distinction between literal and metaphorical. Right? So hot and cold refer literally to temperature, metaphorically to emotion, feeling, and so on. Now, one approach, or some metaphor scholars have said that this assumption is actually wrong. They have said that metaphors are, in fact, literally true. The reference is Glucksberg and Kaiser. But, okay. If you say Sam is a pig, that man is a pig, you would normally say, well, that is a metaphor. The man is not literally a pig. Right? It's not true literally. You understand it metaphorically, and it would mean what? If you say somebody is a pig, it means they are greedy, they are dirty, and so on. Now, if pig means farm animal, and if Sam is a man, to say that Sam is a pig is not literally true. It's got to be metaphorical. But if you say that pig means something else, if you say that pig means simply a dirty, greedy creature, which could be human or animal, then, of course, Sam is a pig is literally true. Okay? And Glucksberg and Kaiser's theory of metaphor is that metaphors are always literally true. What happens when you use a metaphor is that the concept is redefined. Okay? What you have is a recategorization. So pig in its basic sense is the animal. But if you use pig metaphorically, what you're doing, you're giving the word pig a much broader meaning. It means simply dirty creature, of which the farm animal is the prototype, but which includes humans. Okay? So basically what Glucksberg and Kaiser have is metaphor without metaphor. Metaphor which is literally true. Okay, give another example. If you take the verb to go, which is basically, I suppose, a motion verb, you go, you have all sorts of metaphorical uses, such as the milk went sour. Right? The milk started off not sour, and then became sour. The milk went sour. Oh, sorry, another misprint. The lights went. Sorry, the lights went red. The lights went red. The lights are green. The traffic lights are green, and then they go red. Right? So the traffic lights went red. You might say of a person, he went mad. Okay? He is, say, normal. Then he goes mad. And you would say the lights went out. The lights are on, then they go out. So you have all these different uses of go. Is this metaphor? Well, for Lakoff, they would be metaphor. And the metaphor, the underlying metaphor, which I mentioned at the beginning, would be that a state of affairs is a location, and a change is motion from one location to another. So it's as if you say that the milk went sour. The milk first is in one state. It is good, you can drink it. Another state is it is sour, you can't drink it. And the milk then goes from one state to another, it changes. And the underlying metaphor would be the state is a place, it is a location, and if something changes, it goes from one state, from one place to another place. Likewise, Bill went mad. Bill is normal, is a state, is a place, then he goes from normal to mad. And the lights go from green to red. So one approach is to say that, okay, it is metaphor. Clearly, it is metaphor. The basic sense of go is to move in space, but there are these metaphorical uses which mean something changes. Okay? But equally, you could say that this is not metaphor. You could say that go has a very abstract, a very general, a very schematic sense, which means quite simply to change state, which can include to go from the hotel to the airport or to go from green to red. It can include motion events and simply change of state events. And you would say that the prototypical case of go would be to go from one place to another place. so it's essentially the approach would, the alternative approach is that you do not have this relation between source domain and target domain. You simply have a very abstract, very general concept, which can be instantiated in different domains. Another approach is to think of, and this actually is a very traditional one, I think it's one that literature people would probably feel comfortable with, is that metaphor is a kind of analogy. You have two domains, right, two states of affairs, two situations, and then you try to see in which way this is similar to that, and in which way things can be related. And an example of this, actually, this is from a lecture of a couple of days ago. Cervantes, who was a Spanish writer, Cervantes is Spain's Shakespeare. Okay? I don't think you would say that is metaphorical. I don't think you would say that Shakespeare is being used metaphorically. What does it mean? It means that, or rather, how do you interpret that? How do you work out what it means? Well, you draw on what you know. Shakespeare was a writer. He was an English writer, often regarded as the greatest. So what does that say about Cervantes? Well, he occupied or occupies the equivalent position in Spanish literature. So what you're doing is that you're setting up an analogy. You have, actually, so you would have the relation of Shakespeare to England. And there's this Cervantes, who perhaps you don't know much about, but he has a relation to Spain, and then you're saying that the relation here is the same as the relation there. So Spain corresponds to England, and that corresponds to that. So by drawing on what you know here, you can work out what is meant by the sentence, what is meant by the statement that Cervantes is Spain's Shakespeare. Of course, if you didn't know that Shakespeare was English, or didn't know that he is regarded as, the greatest or one of the greatest writers of a certain country, in fact, you wouldn't quite know how to interpret that. But Cervantes is Spain's Shakespeare. Is it a metaphor? Well, is it true? Is it literally true? Well, of course, Cervantes was not Shakespeare, right? The words refer to different people. So the word Shakespeare, so it's not being used literally true to refer to the man, William Shakespeare. You interpret it by analogy, but you can also say, in fact, that Shakespeare comes to mean here a great writer of a particular country. Right? So, interpreted by analogy, the relation between Shakespeare and England is compared with the relation between Cervantes and Spain. And to do this, you actually have to activate all sorts of bits of background knowledge which you may have about Shakespeare and Spain and so on. If you had never heard of Shakespeare, you wouldn't know you would not be able to interpret that. But I say I don't think you would want to regard it as metaphorical. However, analogy, reasoning in this sort of way, can be applied to metaphorical expressions. If you say, that corner shop is a gold mine, I don't know whether you've come across that use of the word gold mine. That corner shop is a gold mine. Now, how do you interpret that? Again, the question is not what is the interpretation of it, but what processes do you go through to come to an interpretation? Okay? So how do you think? What sort of reasoning processes? What goes on inside your head as you try to understand that? Well, how can a corner shop be a gold mine? How can an encyclopedia be a gold mine? Well, how do you interpret it? Well, gold, we know, is very valuable. It's very rare. And a gold mine, well, that's where you find gold, but you've got to work for it. But if you basically you dig a hole in the ground, you pick out gold, and you are rich. Right? Not quite like that, but that's the kind of image that you would create. And to say that a corner shop is a gold mine, well, gold mine gives you gold, which is valuable. So a corner shop, if you own a corner shop and it's a gold mine, it means it gives you a big profit. Right? It gives you a lot of money. Just like if you have a gold mine in your backyard. If you pick up gold out of your garden, well, you have lots of money without any work. So if your shop is a gold mine, then, similarly. And if you say a book, an encyclopedia is a gold mine, well, again, you would interpret it something like that as well. Just as in the gold mine, you get these little bits of yellow metal which are very valuable. So in an encyclopedia, as you look through the encyclopedia, all sorts of little bits of information you can find, which are very interesting and very valuable. Notice that gold mine is interpreted slightly differently. In the second one, it's simply, it provides you with lots of money for no work, or very little work. You simply pick it up. The first one, you have lots of little things which are valuable. And, of course, another way, coming back to the recategorization thing, you can say that gold mine basically means where you get gold, the hole in the ground where you get gold. But gold mine can also come to mean, in these metaphorical expressions, in the second expression, something which provides you with lots of money for very little work. So it becomes recategorized. The third example is often quoted as an example of metaphor. An atom is a miniature solar system. I don't know whether this metaphor is used when you learn physics at school here. The solar system, you have the sun and all the planets moving around it. So the atom, you have the nucleus and all the electrons going around it. An atom is a miniature solar system. Well, it isn't, of course. Atoms and solar systems are quite different kinds of things, but you can draw the analogy. Just as in the solar system you have the sun in the center and the planets moving round, so in the atom you have the nucleus and the electrons going round. So it's interpreted by analogy, and you work out what are the similarities between these two things. Okay? Analogy is another way of approaching metaphor. You take two things which are different. In this case, the structure of the atom and the structure of the solar system, put them together, and you see what are the similarities. How can the structure of one be the same as the structure of the other? What are the similarities? Which is, I think, probably a very traditional approach to metaphor. That probably is what the literature scholars, literature students do with metaphor, actually, very often. How Lakoff's conceptual metaphor would work here, I'm not quite so sure, actually. Okay, to conclude, if you look at those two sentences there, that surgeon is a butcher. Surgeon, you know, a doctor who cuts you up. Okay. So that surgeon is a butcher, and that butcher is a surgeon. Okay, how do you interpret those? If you say that surgeon is a butcher, is he a good surgeon? No. You wouldn't want him to operate on you. That butcher is a surgeon, as a metaphor, of course. That butcher is a surgeon. Is he a good butcher? Yes. It's not a particularly negative thing to say. It probably is a little negative. Now the question is, where do these judgments come from? Why do you interpret the first one, that surgeon is a butcher, to mean that he is a very bad surgeon? He is incompetent. Is it because butchers are incompetent? Well, no. Butchers are perfectly good professionals, perfectly good at their own particular job. But to say the surgeon is a butcher is interpreted negatively. The butcher is a surgeon, I think, probably would mean that butcher is far too precise, far too careful for work as a butcher. So these examples have been used often. These examples have been used to justify the theory of conceptual blending. And in fact, conceptual blending, in fact, it draws on analogy, the analogical approach. And basically, the idea would be this. Now let's see, can I demonstrate this? Now, this one and this one. Yes. Okay, you may have seen pictures like this, but I just mentioned it very briefly. Okay, as in analogy, you have two domains, two areas of experience, which are referred to as the input 1 and input 2. So in interpreting the surgeon is a butcher, input 1 would be surgeons and what they do. Right? Surgeons are medical doctors who perform operations on people, they cut them up and do things inside them. Right? So on your input 1 would be surgeons and what you know about them. Input 2 would be butchers and what you know about them. Okay, they cut up dead animals for meat. Okay, so you have your two input spaces, so two input concepts, which are different. However, you can see that there are similarities. This is where the analogy comes in. And you can see there are similarities. The butcher, both the surgeon and the butcher, these are professions, people with a certain job, right? So these are professions, professional people, and then you can say there's a certain similarity between them. And the similarity is made possible because of the thing at the top, the generic space. That is to say, professional people do certain kinds of work, and they need certain kinds of skills, certain kinds of training, and so on. So at the top is a kind of general idea of professional people with jobs, training, skills, and so on. Examples of that would be the surgeon and the butcher who do certain kinds of things, and you would see other analogies. Surgeons operate on human bodies normally. I suppose a surgeon can operate on an animal as well, but let's say human bodies. Butchers work with dead animal bodies. They both cut them up. All sorts of components of the activity of the surgeon operating in the hospital on the patient. And there you have the butcher with his knife and chopper and the animal carcass and so on and so forth. And there are correspondences and analogies. Not everything has a correspondence. For example, not everything in the two spaces corresponds to other things. Okay? So there are unique aspects to these. And what happens, you then create that. You take certain aspects, certain features from the two input spaces, you put them together, and then you interpret. And what happens when you say the surgeon is a butcher? Well, the surgeon, just like the butcher, uses a sharp knife and cuts an animal and cuts body. In one case it's a human, the other case it's a cow or whatever. But in one case, the surgeon would typically use very great precision and doesn't actually want to damage, doesn't want to hurt the patient. On the contrary, the purpose of all this is to benefit the patient. The other thing would be the butcher simply chops roughly, with the purpose of simply dividing up the animal body into chunks of meat. And putting these things together, you come to the interpretation then that what's happened here? That the butcher, that the surgeon cuts up his patients rather like a butcher cuts up, the cow, basically. In other words, very roughly, very crudely, and the patient has not much chance to survive, or the surgeon is likely to make mistakes and cut in the wrong place or cut the wrong thing out or whatever. Okay, now the idea of, as a conceptual blending, conceptual blending, and this is a theory by Fauconnier and Turner, proposes the idea is elements from two, or in fact sometimes more, input spaces can combine and interact to produce the blended interpretation. And the point that Fauconnier and Turner make is that the theory has, in fact, much, much wider application than simply metaphor. And in fact, the title of their book is The Way We Think, which is a very, it promises a lot. But actually you can see the way in which blending, I'll give you an example of blending which is not linguistic, it's not metaphor. I once saw an advertisement, a big advertisement by the highway, and the advertisement contained simply in the middle a picture of a diamond. Okay? In the middle was a blank advertisement and a picture of a diamond in the middle, right? And the writing on it was simply, chocolates melt. Okay? Can you work that one out? What was being advertised? And what was the point? You had a picture of a diamond, and the words were chocolates melt. I had to think about it, actually. And my interpretation of it was, well, it was advertising diamonds. But what went into the interpretation? Well, the diamond thing. Well, diamonds are traditionally given by men to women on weddings and so on. You give a diamond to your girlfriend, to your wife on your wedding. So diamonds are things that you give to somebody on a special occasion like that. But you also give chocolates to your girlfriend. But there's a difference. Chocolates get eaten very quickly, or else they just melt. They don't last very long. Diamonds, however, last forever. So what was happening here was that you had the two spaces, diamonds, chocolates, things to give, things for men to give their girlfriends and fiancés and wives and so on. And these two bits of knowledge were then put together on this advertisement, and then you have to work out what it means. And it's not easy to work out. And in fact, I'm not actually sure whether my interpretation is what was intended. But that's how I interpreted it. Simply, another way of saying diamonds are forever. The kinds of things that you give your fiancé or whatever, on a wedding ring or whatever. Okay, no, that's not metaphor. No metaphor is involved. It's something much broader than metaphor. And say, according to Connie and Turner, this putting two things together and then you have to work out what it means is actually, they claim, very characteristic aspects of the way humans think. And if you go back even to the very first examples, to arrive at a conclusion, to start out from a premise, what are you putting together? Well, you're putting together knowledge of journeys and traveling, knowledge of how you discuss and argue, looking for analogies, and then working out what it means to say we arrived at the conclusion. Well, in fact, you don't have to work it out because it is a standard expression. It is the standard way of saying it. So the actual blending has become completely automatic. You don't have to think about it. But you can also see how it works with the moving the meeting forward. Well, the way I illustrated on the blackboard or the green board or whatever it is, by doing these little diagrams, that is a kind of blending, in fact, by showing the two different interpretations. On the one hand, let's say you have the spatial notion, right? And then you have the temporal notion, the notion of time. And you put those together, and then you get your interpretation. Okay, that more or less brings me to a conclusion. Perhaps there's one final thing I should have mentioned earlier, actually. I said that conceptual blending is not just metaphor. Okay, conceptual metaphor, blending is not just conceptual metaphor, but equally, of course, metaphor is not just a matter of language. If you look at some of these metaphorical expressions we use, the conceptual metaphors, however you interpret them, whether by analogy or recategorization or blending or whatever, it's not just a question of words, but metaphors can also influence gesture. And to come back to this time thing, I find that, well, observing English speakers, I don't know whether it would work in other cultures and so on, but maybe you can tell me. When you talk about the future, one tends to gesture in the future will do that, the past we did that. Next week we'll do this, last week we did that. So there tends to be this sort of gesturing which is conforms with the metaphor. So the future is ahead, the past is behind. Next week, last week. Do you do that? Okay. Which is quite remarkable if you think about it. And again, this would be an actual non-linguistic, a gestural instantiation of the metaphor. The future there, the past here. So the past, well, you are gestured towards yourself, or you're actually gesturing through your body the past. Okay? Or another common one, actually, if you are not quite sure how to decide something. Do you make this gesture? Do I say this or do I say that? What am I doing? Metaphorically, I have two objects and I'm trying to find out which is the heavier one. I'm comparing the weight of things. So when you're comparing the weight of things, metaphoric, by means of gesture, the expression corresponding to that is you weigh something up. Right? You evaluate something and try to decide whether it's right or wrong. Right? So there is, interestingly, this metaphorical basis also of gesture, which is, as I say, not... So metaphor, the conceptual metaphor, is not just language. Right? It's also gesture which can obviously accompany language. So, to conclude then, the topics we've looked at, metaphor, conceptual metaphor, blending, analogy, and so on. It's a controversial area. People disagree, but clearly it is a very, very important field of study. And what is actually quite remarkable is the degree of universality of this. These things crop up in different languages, or very similar things occur in different languages and different cultures, however, with small differences very often, which makes it, of course, particularly interesting. Okay, so I'll finish there, and thank you for your patience and attention.